Hi class, welcome to this Unit 2 update here for History 130. I thought I would do an update now that I have caught up on grading lessons 5, 6, and 7, grading the discussion boards. And I've also, by the way, submitted the midterm grades that are based on everything up through lesson 7. So those are now submitted as of tonight, October 15th. So you can check those out if you're curious about your progress in the course. And I figured I should do a quick recap of these recent lessons here. Uh, Now that we're basically hitting the halfway mark in the course. So let's have a quick look at Lesson 5, the Lesson 5 quiz on populism and U.S. imperialism. And we have question 1 here. The purpose of the Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883 was primarily to fill some government jobs on the basis of competitive examinations to reduce cronyism and corruption. Right? This is kind of exactly the opposite. This one up here, it did not want to make it easier to staff agencies with hand-picked favorites. That was the spoils system that was in place before this reform. So yeah, it's that one. Fill some jobs on the basis of competitive exams. Question 2, the populist movement advocated for all of the following reforms except, so let's see, did they want the ability to introduce direct citizen referendums onto ballots? Yes, they did. They wanted more direct participation in that manner. So that's something they did want, which means it can't be our answer. We're looking for the exception. What about, did they want the ability to recall elected officials? Yes, they also had that idea too. Did they want the ability to launch citizen initiatives to vote on new legislation through direct votes? Yes, that as well. The one thing they did not want was the ability to own land as an absentee landlord. The Omaha platform specifically targets that. It says, land out west is being held by speculators and bankers and foreign owners, and the Omaha platform calls for that land to be turned over to real, actual settlers who are going to live on that land and improve it. So this would be the answer right here on question 2. Question 3, one of the primary beliefs of the populist movement was that, let's see, did they believe that creating more dollars that were backed by silver would lead to a ruinous decrease in the prices of agricultural goods? No, not at all. They actually did want more dollars to be created and backed by silver. And they wanted that because it would actually lead to an increase in prices of agricultural goods, which would help farmers. So not far from being ruinous to the farmers, it would actually be quite helpful. At least they thought so. So that can't be the answer. Did they want to cut down on government programs and regulations as if that were the most efficient means creating fair and prosperous economic conditions? No, that's not really their program. Think about how they wanted the government to regulate or own the railroads and telegraph lines, and telephone lines, how they wanted a graduated income tax. So I don't think you could quite characterize this as their belief. What about that there was too much power in the hands of a few corporations and financial institutions? Yeah, that's exactly the main part of their message. And what about tariff rates needing to be increased in order to protect American industry? No, actually, the populists, if anything, disliked the tariffs. They, because it made goods more expensive for farmers to purchase. Farmers couldn't purchase cheaper foreign-made manufactured goods. They had to buy the more expensive American goods. And a lot of countries would retaliate with their own tariffs which actually sometimes hit the very goods that farmers were trying to export to European countries and elsewhere. So not only would farmers have to pay more for imports, but they'd get fewer exports when other countries retaliated with their tariffs on American goods, such as farm produce, such as grain. So if anything, the populace wanted to lower tariffs so that imported manufactured goods would be cheaper for farmers to buy, and so that other countries might lower their tariffs and allow American farmers to export more easily. So it can't be the tariff one. It's this answer right here. Question 4. The 1892 Omaha platform of the People's Party included all of the following proposals except, so did it call for the establishment of postal savings banks administered by the government? Yes. Did it call for government ownership of the railroad, telegraph, and telephone industries? Yes. Did it call for keeping tight limits on the money supply by a strict adherence to the gold standard? No, quite the opposite. It called for expansion of the money supply by going to the bimetallic 16-to-1 silver standard, what they called free silver at the time. So this is the answer here. This is the exception. And of course they did want a graduated income tax. So they wanted these three things. They did not want tight limits on the money supply. Question 5. The populist movement saw which of the following groups as their greatest enemy? Big business. Whereas all these other groups, the populists tried to include in their coalition. They appealed to women by arguing for the women's right to vote. They incorporated African Americans into their movement, albeit in segregated chapters, but it was better than nothing. And of course, they really appealed to small businesses, but they targeted big businesses as the enemy. Question 6. Historians have offered all the following interpretations of the populist movement of the late 1800s, except. So, which of these views is not a plausible interpretation? In other words, what about the idea that its members tried to offer a democratic alternative to the control of America by corporate capitalism? Yes, you will hear some left-wing historians take that view. What about the idea that its members were victims of economic distress caused by drought, debt, and economic depression? Yeah, that's one sympathetic way that they're often viewed. What about that the members of the populist movement had a naive and conspiratorial view of politics that led them to unfairly blame bankers and Jews for most of their troubles? Yeah, some historians will even kind of draw attention to those aspects of the populist movement which were there, and they'll kind of emphasize those parts of it. And that's those historians who have a less sympathetic take on the populist movement would emphasize that part. What about an idea that the populist movement saw wasteful government taxing, spending, and regulations as the main threats to liberty? No. There's really no historian that would argue that, and it really wouldn't make sense to argue that, considering that the populists were calling for more regulations on business. Question 7. Oh, so that would be the answer. Question 7. Those in favor of American territorial expansion in the late 1800s offered all the following economic and social reasons for this expansion, except. And right here, right off the bat's our answer. The Philippines were not any threat. There was no threat of the Philippines invading the U.S. So that's not a plausible reason that could be given at the time. Whereas these others are plausible reasons that were given explicitly by people like Grover Cleveland. And by the way, I thought the class did a great job analyzing, that source and the different reasons for the U.S. getting involved in Latin America and the Pacific. These include things like, wanting to forge feelings of national unity, protecting American business investments and missionaries, and ensuring unobstructed access to overseas markets and raw materials. Question 8. In the 1890s, Spain and the United States gradually moved toward war over Cuba for all the following reasons except. So did American businesses have investments in Cuba? Yes. Did the crumbling Spanish Empire look like a weak and appealing target? Yes. Did Spain's navy threaten to capture Washington, D.C.? No, that's not a threat that was ever given. But did the Spanish commit atrocities against Cuban rebels that made Americans sympathetic to the Cubans and want to punish the Spanish? Yes. Question 9. The Platt Amendment, which the U.S. forced Cuba to incorporate into Cuba's new constitution, gave Cuba the right to have representatives in Congress? No. Foreign aid subsidies to help with economic reconstruction in Cuba after the war? No. The obligation to allow the U.S. to control its commerce and foreign policy and set up a naval base in Cuba? Yes. Full independence? No. No, I don't think you could call Cuba's government after the incorporation of the Platt Amendment full independence. It's when a foreign government gets to veto your policies at will and has a naval station right nearby on your island just to keep an eye on things. I wouldn't really call that full independence. I mean, maybe this is a subjective term, but I think the best answer is this one right here. Obligation to give the U.S. more control. Question 10. Examples of U.S. foreign interventions in the decades between the Spanish-American War and World War I included all of the following except. So did the U.S. send Marines to help put down the Boxer Rebellion? Yes. So that can't be the answer. Sanctions to punish the country of Panama for its revolt against neighboring Colombia? No. In fact, the U.S. was the one that encouraged that revolt because Colombia would not give us the land for the Panama Canal at a price that we liked. So we helped stage a revolt to set up a new government that would do business with us so we could build the Panama Canal. So that's the answer right there. Whereas, the Banana Wars, yes. And the Philippine Insurrection, putting that down, yes. Those were U.S. interventions. So, boo, 10 out of 10. All right. So that's lesson 5. Let's go on to lesson 6. Question 1. Progressive reforms from 1900 to 1920 included all the following except. So did they include anti-monopoly legislation? Oh, yeah. Lowering income taxes on the wealthy? No, the exact opposite. In fact, increasing income taxes on the wealthy, considering that, there was, before the Progressive Era, no income tax at all on the wealthy. And then after a constitutional amendment, there was suddenly a small, albeit obviously larger than before, income tax. So this is the answer here. Of course, there was food safety legislation, prohibition of alcohol, but the exception is this, the income taxes on the wealthy. They were raised, not lowered. Question 2, the progressive strategy of handing political problems over to supposedly impartial, apolitical experts was applied to all the following fields during the Progressive Era except. So was it applied to the election of senators with the overturning of the 17th Amendment? No. In fact, it was during the Progressive Era when the 17th Amendment was enacted, and it's never been overturned. That's kind of a red herring here. So this is, before the 17th Amendment, senators were appointed by state legislatures. So in a sense, they were kind of appointed by experts. Whereas after this amendment, they became directly elected by voters. So this is one instance where this is kind of an exception to the typical trend in the Progressive Era, which is to put more decision-making power in the hands of experts. So with all these other 3 things, which did happen in the Progressive Era, you had experts taking more control, over the money supply, over education curriculum, over the prescription of drugs, in particular opiates. Right? Question 3. Which of the following electoral reforms was not promoted by both the populist and progressive movements? So, did both want to grant women the right to vote? Yes. Did both want stricter voter literacy tests, especially in southern states, in order to keep the poor, uneducated whites and blacks from voting? No. The progressive movement did, or at least some in the progressive movement did, but the populist movement did not call for that sort of thing. The populist movement, if anything, wanted ordinary people, blacks and whites alike, to be more involved in the political process, not less. So this is one area in which populism and the progressive era, or progressive movement diverged, or I should say the progressive movement diverged from the earlier demands of the populist movement. What about using secret ballots when voting? Yes, both were in favor of that. And both were in favor of allowing voters to directly propose vote on state level referendums by petition. So the one exception where you didn't have both is this one right here. Voter literacy tests. Question 4. Of the following themes or arguments that were present in Upton Sinclair's socialist book, The Jungle, the one that most powerfully resonated with middle-class progressive readers was the argument that did they care the most, basically what got the most attention in this book? Was it the message, which was pretty clearly written in the book, that the capitalist system exploited workers, was an inhumane jungle that pitted every person against everyone else and needed to be overthrown? That's not really what middle-class readers emphasized, even though that really was part of the author's intent of writing the book. What about the idea that hardworking immigrant workers deserve more legal protections and sympathy? That was another implied message in the book, but it's also one that middle-class readers didn't really focus on. What about the unclean practices of the meatpacking industry that were endangering the health of consumers who bought the packaged meat? Ding, ding, ding. That's what middle-class readers especially focused on, because immediately there was an outcry about the unclean meat, and you had the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act passed very quickly in Congress. What about the idea that the unsafe practices of the meatpacking industry were endangering the safety of workers in the industry? That attracted much less attention and excitement from middle-class readers. Eventually, there was some legislation passed to try to deal with workplace safety, but not right away. Issue still hadn't been dealt with 6 years after this book came out, when Theodore Roosevelt was running for election in 1912, and he states in his speech that one of the things he thinks still needs to be addressed is unsafe workplaces. Question 5. The Elkins Act and Hepburn Act aimed to bring which changes to the railroad industry? Allowed the government through the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate the rates charged by railroad companies. These others, not really, no. Preventing railroad strikes, no. Put all railroads under U.S. government ownership, no. The progressive leaders like Theodore Roosevelt didn't want to go that far towards socialism. To build publicly owned railroad lines that would compete with existing privately owned lines, no. It's just to have the federal government oversee railroad rates. Question 6. Which of the following progressive reforms diverged the most from the philosophy of the populist movement before it? So the Clayton Antitrust Act, that's to break up monopolies, which the populists were also on board with. So no, that's not the answer. The 16th Amendment, that creates the direct income tax, which the populists were also in favor of, so that's not a divergence. The Keating-Owen Child Labor Act, No, the populace also felt like workers and child workers were being brutalized and exploited by businesses, by big businesses especially. So both were in favor of that. But the Federal Reserve Act, on the other hand, this went totally against the populist idea of expanding the money supply and allowing citizens more direct input into monetary policy, into the management of the money supply. The populists wanted more direct citizen participation in that, but this did the total opposite. This put the money supply in the hands of an appointed board of experts, basically, and it kept the U.S. strictly on the gold standard. So populists were not happy with this progressive reform. So this is the divergence here. Question 7, which activist is paired incorrectly below with their primary issue of concern? That would be Emma Goldman. She was actually an anarchist. So last thing she would have really wanted was the prohibition of alcohol. She would have not wanted the government to have more regulatory powers, right? Whereas Jane Addams did do the settlement house movement to help immigrants and poor people kind of get settled in life, get on their feet, learn how to read if they didn't know already. Susan B. Anthony, women's right to vote. Yeah, that's accurate. And Margaret Sanger, birth control legalization. Yep, that's also accurate. Question 8, which presidential candidate obtained the second most amount of popular votes in the 1912 election? That would be Theodore Roosevelt. And by the way, with some of these questions, keep in mind, you can always Google these key terms. If you're not sure if Margaret Sanger was matched up with birth control legalization, there's no time limit on these quizzes. So whatever tools you need to use to help you learn the material, as long as you are, of course, learning it, not just like taking down the answers verbatim from someone else, punching them in. Whatever helps you learn is fair game. So, question 9: which African American reformer of the late 1800s and early 1900s believed that African Americans needed to postpone struggles for equal political rights in favor of focusing first on economic advancement through vocational training, such as the sort that was available at his Tuskegee Institute? That's Booker T. Washington. Question 10, which of the following progressive reforms would end up being overturned in the 1930s for being perceived to be too moralistic, burdensome, and dangerous in its unintended consequences? That's the prohibition of alcohol. Let's make sure I did it all right. Yep, 10 out of 10. All right, moving on to lesson 7. Question 1, all of the following countries fought on the side of the Central Powers in World War I, except for Serbia. Right, Serbia is the one that was going against Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary was accusing Serbia of supporting those terrorists that killed the Austro-Hungarian heir to the throne. So if you know that Austria-Hungary is one of the Central Powers, you know that Serbia can't be, because they're enemies. And of course, Germany was Austria-Hungary's ally. The Ottoman Empire was part of this allied Central Powers bloc. So Serbia is the odd man out here. Question 2, all of the following factors contributed to rising tensions among the European empires leading up to World War I, except. So were there opposing alliances that heightened the stakes of war? Yes. Was there a naval arms race? Yes. Were there disagreements over how to respond to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia? No. Not leading up to World War I. After World War I, there were disagreements about that, sure. But this Bolshevik Revolution hadn't happened yet until halfway through World War I. So there couldn't have been disagreements about it at this point. What about competition over colonies around the world? Yes, definitely. Question 3. Germany and Britain played different roles in World War I in which of the following ways? Did only Germany use poison gases? No, Britain used them too. Did only Germany attempt a naval blockade of its opponents? No, Britain did as well. Did only Germany have an elected parliament that voted in favor of the war? No, Britain did as well. Did only Germany invade neutral Belgium? Yes. Ding, ding, ding. That's a unique mark against Germany there. Question 4. American reasons for supporting Britain and France in World War I include all the following except. So, were they worried about loans not being paid back? Yes. Did France suddenly need a lot more help to defeat Germany after the Russian Revolution? Yes. Did Germany resume unrestricted submarine warfare? Yes. Did France send the Zimmermann telegram? No, it was Germany. So this is the exception. This is not a reason to support, not a reason that existed to support France and Britain. America's combat role in World War I. This one right here was sizable. Was not more extensive than the French and British contributions. It was honestly, less. But did involve quite a few troops. Went way beyond just naval battles with the German Navy. It was pretty sizable. Question 6. After the U.S.'s entry to World War I, the U.S. government tried to encourage support for the war and discourage opposition to the war with all the following policies except. So did they pass the Espionage and Sedition Acts? Yes. They create the Committee on Public Information to produce pro-war propaganda? Yes. Did they, the U.S. government, include financial support for the American Civil Liberties Union? No. The American Civil Liberties Union actually gets set up in response to or against all these restrictions on freedom of speech, to try to protect freedom of speech. So that would have gone against the U.S. government's intentions. So this is the exception. Did the U.S. government arrest and deport some anti-war radicals such as Emma Goldman? Yes. Question 7. During World War I, the status of African Americans changed in all the following ways except. So did hundreds of thousands serve in the U.S. military, albeit in segregated units? Yes. Did African Americans feel renewed determination to engage in political activism as they suffered continued second-class treatment in the U.S. despite their sacrifices for the war? Yes. Did hundreds of thousands move from the rural South to industrial jobs in the North? Yes. Did segregation and racism mostly end thanks to their service in the war? No. It's not until the 1960s that this, really ends. So this is obviously the exception, the thing that did not happen. Question 8. Woodrow Wilson's plan for peace and his 14 points include all the following proposals except. So did it include support for national self-determination for most colonized people in the world? Yes. And keep in mind, we're talking about the 14 points here. We're not talking about the actual Treaty of Versailles, which ends up getting rid of some of these idealistic demands. We're talking about the 14 points, which was very idealistic. So yes, it did support self-determination around the world. Partial reduction of armaments after the war? Yes. Forcing Germany to pay over $30 billion in war reparations? No. That was not included in Woodrow Wilson's plan, in his 14 points plan, although it was something included in the actual Treaty of Versailles after the war at the demand of Britain and France. So this is the exception here. This is not what Woodrow Wilson envisioned. And of course, he did envision a League of Nations to handle future diplomatic disputes, but did not want to punish Germany and make Germany vengeful, eager for revenge by saddling it with all this debt. But Britain and France did, and they got their way because they had done more of the sacrifices in the war. Question 9. The actual peace agreement that Germany signed after the war, the Treaty of Versailles, the actual peace agreement, stipulated all the following except. So did it say Germany would have to pay tens of billions in war reparations? Yes. Did it say that Germany's colonies in Africa would be given their independence rather than be given to enlarge the British and French empires? No. The British and French empires just end up taking over those colonies. So this is not, this is the exception here. Did it say Germany would not be allowed to station troops in the Rhineland border region next to France? Yes, it did say that. And did it say Germany would have to limit the size of its navy and armed forces severely? Yes. All these punishments Germany found very intolerable and gave ammunition to people like Hitler, who promised to get rid of these restrictions. Question 10. World War I led to all of the following changes on the home front in America except. So did it lead to a decrease in the U.S. federal government's debt? No, led to an increase. So this is the exception right here. Did it lead to increased employment of women in industrial jobs? Yes. Rationing of some consumer goods? Yes. Government price controls and regulation of businesses' production priorities? Yes. And 10 out of 10. All right, so that's the quizzes recapped. I'm not going to do the lesson 8 quiz because technically students still have until Saturday at midnight to finish that. Along with the Unit 2 exam is also due Saturday at midnight. Keep that in mind this week if you haven't done that already. All right, so that's all I have for now. Best of luck and see you next time.